Good afternoon. My name is Sunshine Menezes, and I am the Executive Director of the Metcalf Institute for Marine and Environmental Reporting at the University of Rhode Island's Graduate School of Oceanography. We are here today to honor the 2011 Grantham Prize winners, and on behalf of Metcalf Institute and the Grantham Foundation for the Protection of the Environment, which generously supports this award, I'd like to welcome you all here and thank you for attending. I'd also like to say a few words about who we are and what this prize is all about, just to set the stage for today. Metcalf Institute is named in honor of the late Michael P. Metcalf, who was the editor of the Providence Journal, and rather the publisher of the Providence Journal, which is the oldest continuously running daily newspaper in the country, and something of which we in Little Rhode are very proud. And an affiliation that we're very proud to have also, because Mr. Metcalf was a very strong advocate, not only for exceptional journalism, but also for environmental issues, and was also a strong supporter of the Graduate School of Oceanography. So we're very pleased to carry on in his honor. We have a simple goal, which is not necessarily an easy one, but it's a simple one. We want to encourage high-quality reporting on the environment, and we want to do this by giving journalists a better understanding of the day-to-day activities of scientists, the process of scientific research, and the culture and norms of science so that they can more effectively report on these science-based issues that are so important to all of us today. We do this in a number of ways. We hold an annual week-long science immersion workshop for journalists. We hold multiple science seminars for reporters and editors each year, and all of these, again, are to improve their knowledge of not only timely environmental topics, but also a better understanding of scientific research and methods and peer review, and how to actually translate scientific writing into something that the public can not only understand, but actually wants to read. We strive to help our participants understand that environmental stories should not be relegated to a single section, because these scientific and environmental issues actually intersect now with economics and politics and all aspects of our daily lives. And therefore, we put an important focus on the integration of all of these things in the programs that we do at Metcalf Institute. It is easy to be disheartened about the quality and quantity of environmental coverage, especially in a year like this one, when we have heard much about war and political intrigue and political discourse, if you want to use that generous word, and global economic troubles and natural disasters. But as you will see today, there are many journalists, and definitely some here today, who see this as an opportunity to look below the surface of the more predictable coverage, to tell moving and powerful stories about the environment that actually have the potential to affect change. The work of these journalists and the mission of Metcalf Institute received a huge boost 7 years ago from Jeremy and Hannah Grantham with their family foundation, the Grantham Foundation for the Protection of the Environment. The Granthams came to us because they were deeply concerned about the state of the planet and about the public's lack of knowledge regarding environmental issues. Their family foundation aims to not only raise awareness about these urgent environmental issues, but also to support collaboration and communication regarding environmental protection. Mr. and Mrs. Grantham wanted to provide an annual prize for environmental journalism, and this was a great fit for Metcalf Institute's mission. It's not only a way to bring public attention to the very best environmental writing each year, it's also a way to encourage journalists to stay in this field and to continue to produce the very best reporting on these issues that are so important to all of us. The Granthams wanted to make this prize something that people would sit up and take notice of, and I believe that we've succeeded. 6 years on, we've honored 23 journalists with the Grantham Prize, which carries a $75,000 award, and nearly 80 journalists have shared the $5,000 awards of special merit, which are the runner-up awards each year. With our outstanding jurors and our meticulous judging process, we've built a strong reputation in the journalism community, and the prize is really making a difference in the nation's newsrooms. You'll hear more about this from our jury chair in just a moment. And this brings me finally to introducing today's agenda. We are here, as I said, to recognize the winners of the 2011 Grantham Prize and the Grantham Awards of Special Merit, all of whom have made fantastic contributions to journalism and to public understanding of environmental issues. Before proceeding, I would briefly like to thank Columbia University for hosting us today, and also Climate Week New York City for including us as an affiliate event in their program. I should note that program's running all of this week, and there's a lot more information about this on their website. And of course, finally, I would like to offer our sincere thanks to Jeremy and Hannelore Grantham and the Grantham Foundation for supporting the Grantham Prize and for their commitment to expanding and improving the public dialogue about environmental issues. So with that, it is my pleasure to welcome the chairman of the Grantham Prize jury, Mr. David Boardman. David is the executive editor and senior vice president of the Seattle Times and seattletimes.com. As an editor for the Times, David has directed 3 Pulitzer Prize-winning team projects and edited 6 other stories that were Pulitzer finalists. He is the former president of Investigative Reporters and Editors and an officer of the American Society of News Editors. And I should also note that David has been a juror for the Grantham Prize since the very beginning, and he's therefore very well qualified to introduce you to all of the jurors and to tell you a little bit more about the process of this prize. Thank you.
Thanks, Sunshine, and thank you all for coming. As Sunshine mentioned, I'm the editor of the Seattle Times, and I like to tell people that these days that means I'm not only the editor of the newspaper, but of our website, our iPhone app, our Android app, our tablet app, our 5 Facebook pages, our 8 Twitter feeds, and if you want me to come read the paper to you over your breakfast cereal, I'm happy to do that too. Such is the lot of an executive in legacy news media these days. Our business models, as you all know, are in great turmoil. Our resources have been decimated. And many of the things that we thought we knew about our industry and our profession are in question. It's perhaps the most challenging time in the history of American professional journalism. But it's clearly the most exciting time, an era of awesome opportunity and possibility. The emerging technologies offer us new ways to marry the experience and the skills of trained journalists with the wisdom of the crowd, to engage readers and viewers in mutually enriching conversations, and to deliver news and information to people when, where, and how they want it. Unfortunately, at this point in time, many are using these tools in a far more cynical fashion. Increasingly, the motivation for many journalists is not civic improvement, but personal celebrity, self-aggrandizement, self-possessed individual brands, and getting the story first, even if it's wrong. In that situation, it's a particularly perilous time for journalism, and in particular for environmental journalism. Stories on climate change, species extinction, deforestation, ocean acidification, these must compete for time and attention with the latest on Charlie Sheen and the Kardashians. It's a tough battle. That's where the Grantham Prize for Excellence in Reporting on the Environment comes in. In each of its 7 years since Jeremy and Hannelore Grantham had this inspiration, the prize has grown in its prestige and its influence in the profession. This is a factor not only of the lucrative $75,000 bounty that comes with it, the richest prize in American journalism, but because of the quality of its winners. We've recognized work from nearly every medium, from books to magazines to television to digital sites. We've recognized the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times, PBS Frontline. We've also recognized the Daily Historian of Astoria, Oregon, and the Record of Hackensack, New Jersey, and 2 Canadian independent authors. The quality and the breadth of these awarded entries is a direct result of the quality of the jury process. I've been fortunate enough to have been a judge on many of journalism's most prestigious prizes, including, in fact, the Pulitzer Prizes, which are conducted about 2 blocks on this very campus, 2 blocks away on this very campus. And I can say without reservation that none have processes as careful and complete as this one. The 2 people who oversee the process are Sunshine Menezes and Bud Ward. Bud's unable to be with us here today because of another obligation. He is a renowned environmental journalist who's one of the founders of the Society of Environmental Journalists. He established the Environmental Health Center and today is editor of the Yale Forum on Climate Change and the Media. Bud and Sunshine work with a group of highly qualified screeners to sort through the original group of entries and identify 2 to 3 dozen that will compete for the prize. These are then sent out to the 5 jurors who spend many, many hours over the course of many weeks studying them before we convene in person in Rhode Island in the spring, where we push and pull on each other, drink vodka root beer floats, and finally agree on a winner or two on these two, and 2 or 3, on a winner and 2 or 3 awards of merit. It's my pleasure to introduce you to this year's jury, most of whom are here with us today. In addition to myself, they are James T. Hamilton, Jay Hamilton, and Jay, where are you? If you'll stand, please. Thank you. Jay is one of 2 new jurors this year. He is a professor of public policy at Duke University's Sanford School of Public Policy, and he's director of the DeWitt Wallace Center for Media and Democracy. He's a noted scholar who's uniquely qualified for this duty, as he has studied the impact of economic forces both on the business of journalism and on environmental regulation. He's received several awards for his accomplishments in teaching and research, including Harvard's Kennedy School of Government's Goldsmith Book Prize in 1999. Thank you, Jay. Next juror is Suzanne Reber. She's our other new juror. Suzanne's the Deputy Managing Editor of Investigations for National Public Radio. She leads NPR's investigative unit and works across the network to build investigative journalism. Prior to joining NPR, she built an investigative news program at the CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, where she led its news investigative unit from 2003 to 2010. She had a distinguished career there, won many awards, including from the Online News Association and from investigative reporters and editors. And then the final juror who's here in attendance is Robert Semple Jr. Bob. Since 1988, Bob's been the associate editor of the editorial page of the New York Times. He too is uniquely qualified for this jury duty. He's one of the nation's foremost environmental journalists. His boyish looks aside, Bob started with the Times in 1963. And in fact, Dan Rather, who's in our audience, was remembering when he and Bob both covered the White House back in the 60s. Bob has worked for the Times as deputy national editor in New York, as London bureau chief, and as op-ed editor. In 1996, he won the Pulitzer Prize for editorial writing on environmental issues. Our final juror, who is unable to be with us today, is Deborah Potter. And Deborah is the executive director of News Lab, which provides training and online resources for journalists in all media. She's a highly regarded guest lecturer and leads workshops for journalists and students worldwide. She's a veteran TV reporter, spent 16 years as a network correspondent for CBS News and for CNN. So now it's time to meet the winners. Each of them will be introduced by a juror. Each will then talk about their award-winning entries and take your questions. After they present individually, we'll bring them all back up to the stage to take questions from you, perhaps from each other, and to talk not only about their specific works, but about the state of environmental journalism and whatever else might be on your minds. So onward. We'll start with Bob Semple, who will introduce our first award of special merit winner.
Well, thank you, Sunshine. Thank you, David. Jeff Goodell is the guy I'm introducing. Jeff's personal CV reads a bit like one of those authors' bios you would find on the dust jacket of an old John Steinbeck novel. It says that he was born in California and raised there and has worked variously and in no particular order that I know of as a blackjack dealer, a glazier, a janitor, a bartender at a topless club, an editor at a Russian literary magazine, and a technical writer at Apple Computer. At some point along the way, Jeff decided to go straight and write excellent books about environmental matters. It was in that capacity that I met him when I telephoned him to seek his thoughts about the political power and sorry environmental record of the coal industry, on which he had written a well-received book published in 2006 called Big Coal: The Dirty Secret Behind America's Energy Future. In that book and in other works, including his present journalism for Rolling Stone magazine, Jeff has established himself as one of the country's foremost writers on environmental issues, a reputation reinforced and indeed enlarged by the book for which he is being recognized today. That book is called How to Cool the Planet. It is a serious book that also happens to be immensely readable. What it does in a nutshell is introduce us to the world of geoengineering and a small band of scientists and engineers who are experimenting with brightening the clouds, seeding the oceans, and other last-ditch, but in many cases quite plausible ways to cool the planet, if, as seems entirely possible, our present efforts to stop global warming end in failure. Mr. Goodell obviously hopes for a different outcome, hopes also that society will come to its senses and display the political will to stop loading greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. But if it does not, he has assembled a wonderful cast of characters and their strategies for compensating for our folly. I'm happy on behalf of the Granthams, the Metcalf Institute, and my fellow jurors to award Jeff Goodell an award of special merit. Jeff. Now, do I give it to Jeff? All right. Oh, this is the hard, as you can see. All right, there it is.
Thank you.
Yours, before I drop it.
All right, thank you very much.
And congratulations. It was really a great book.
Thank you very much. No, that's mine. That's mine.
That's you.
Yeah, okay.
I almost took his speech. It's all yours.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that introduction. John Steinbeck happened to have been my favorite writer as a kid, so to be compared even in passing with him is very nice. So I first want to say how deeply honored I am to have gotten this award. This book was by far the riskiest thing I've ever done as a journalist. After all, it's about a subject that anyone who thinks about it for 2 seconds realizes is a very crazy idea, which is that human beings would actually try to manipulate the Earth's climate. That we would even be at that stage, and our thinking as human beings sounds like a science fiction novel writ large, a kind of ultimate expression of human hubris. I remember one of the very first conferences I ever went to, one of the scientists there kind of shook his head as we were walking out, and he said, "The Frankenplanet solution." And it's true, there's something about that. So what I want to do today is just talk for a few minutes and show you some pictures. And tell you why, of all crazy things, I would decide to write a book about this. Why not just dismiss this as one of those lunatic ideas that should be kept in the closet and kind of forgotten about? The first part of this story starts in Silicon Valley for me, because I grew up in Silicon Valley, as Bob mentioned, and I worked at Apple. And in Silicon Valley, they do something like they put technological optimism in the water like fluoride there. And everybody gets it. And you can't grow up there without thinking that technology can solve problems. And I grew up very deeply with that idea, that technology is a very useful tool and that it can have unexpected solutions to problems that seem unsolvable. And that was something that I just had in my bones. I didn't really realize that I had until I started getting out into the world more. But I think it is deeply in the roots of where I came from. And then, as Bob mentioned, as a journalist, I covered a lot of things, but then I ended up spending 4 years writing a book about the coal industry. I went all around the world, went to China, spent a lot of time in Appalachia, of course, big coal burning power plants in the southeast. And the conclusion I came to after 4 years of thinking about the coal industry was two things. One, we're not going to stop burning coal anytime soon. And two, we're not going to fix coal. We're not going to, this clean coal notion that some of you may have heard about is a fantasy and a kind of ad slogan concocted by the industry, and that these ideas that we're going to take carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases out of coal is not going to happen on any scale that matters. So basically, that means we're in a very scary scenario. And I remember seeing this graph, which is just I'm not going to do any other graphs, but just this one, which basically is the various IPCC emissions scenarios. And you can see that with the highest one, which is here, we're looking at a 6 degree, just about a 5.5 degree temperature change by the end of the century. Now, of course, it's been upped. MIT is talking about even could go up as high as 9 degrees. Talking about big changes coming if we don't lower emissions. And if we can't get a handle on coal, we're not going to lower emissions, because coal is responsible for about 40% of the global CO2 emissions. But after talking to climate scientists on my book, I also realized that even if we do cut emissions really fast right now, we're still not going to lower the temperature of the planet this century. We can certainly stop the rise of temperature. We can slow it down. Emissions reductions are, of course, important and the way to solve this problem. But if you really had to cool off the planet for some reason, like, say, runaway melting in the Arctic, massive droughts, some reasons that you could easily imagine, it's not really easy, it's not possible to do. And so what would we do if there were a climate emergency? What would we do if we saw runaway melting in the Arctic, if there was panic over famines, if rainfall was changing in a dramatic way and there was calls for action, political action? So that's what I was sort of where I was about 4 years ago, right before I started this book. And then a paper by a Nobel Prize-winning scientist named Paul Crutzen passed my desk, was emailed to me by a California venture capitalist. And he basically made the argument, he took geoengineering out of the closet. He pointed out that volcanoes put particles into the atmosphere naturally. And there's lots of evidence that large volcanic eruptions that put these particles high in the stratosphere cool off the Earth's climate. They know this from Mount Pinatubo and from other eruptions. So Paul Crutzen made public something a lot of scientists have been talking about in private, which is, what if we build an artificial volcano? It won't solve our emissions problems. It's not a substitute for cutting emissions, but maybe it could cool things off and buy us time. And it was a very provocative idea, one that got him in caused a lot of controversy. But no one had really thought about how to do it. But it immediately intrigued me, because I had just come out of the coal book, and I thought, wow, that is a really interesting idea. I started asking around as a journalist about this, as one does, and I was immediately told, you have to go see a man named Lowell Wood, who has thought about this more than anyone. And Lowell Wood is, in the world of nuclear physics, a very famous character. He was the protege. He worked at Lawrence Livermore Lab. He was one of the key people in the Star Wars missile defense system, where they would build lasers and to shoot atomic weapons, shoot down atomic weapons before they were launched. Big congressional scandal, as many of you may know about this. And after the Cold War ended and Star Wars became less important, Lowell started thinking about other things. And one of the things he started thinking about was, how might we use technology to solve or address climate change? And for Lowell, who was used to putting lasers in the sky, putting a few sulfur particles up there was not a very big deal. And I went to see him, and I would carefully say that he's pretty close to the borderline of crazy, but in a very brilliant way. Everything he says shakes you up. Everything he says makes you think differently. And he basically laid out these scenarios about how we might build essentially a garden hose, hanging from a hot air balloon. And with one garden hose hanging from a hot air balloon, we could put enough sulfur particles into the stratosphere to cool off the planet, essentially equivalent to a doubling of CO2 emissions, which is the sort of benchmark climate scientists use. And he talked about other things like brightening clouds and machines that could pull CO2 out of the atmosphere. And he was very interesting because there was no, oh, this is a bad science fiction novel writ large, or this is scary. He's like, no, this is what we're going to do. You know why? It's cheap and it's fast. And America and the world loves cheap, fast solutions to our problems. We like diet pills. We don't like running marathons. This is a diet pill. And whether you like it or not, this is how we're going to get skinny. And that was a very, very scary but intriguing idea to me. Lowell talked about these questions of leverage. He's a physicist. So 5 grams of sulfur in the stratosphere, not very much, can offset the warming potential of a ton of carbon. Huge, huge. So what that means is you don't have to put much sulfur in the atmosphere to offset the warming, and it's very cheap to do. That cost is essentially not an issue. But Lowell started to think, and he also showed me, this is a picture of a cloud brightening machine that he had a version of when we were there. Another way to reflect sunlight away from the planet is to brighten clouds over the ocean, in certain parts of the ocean. And that's, again, a relatively simple and less scary idea, but you use, this machine just sprays essentially ocean droplets up into the atmosphere, and the salt particles become condensation nuclei for the clouds and create these low-lying clouds that reflect away sunlight. And you can begin to see how you could manipulate the climate in that way. And a fleet of these, 1,000 or so of these, robotically moving around in the oceans was something, of course, someone like Lowell, who loves machinery, loved the idea of playing with 1,000 cloud boats out in the ocean somewhere. But has since been taken up by a number of other scientists and is a very possible idea, which I'll talk more about in a second. But the thing that intrigued me most about my conversation with Lowell, and I think it really made me throw myself into this book, was this, what he said to me, this is like nothing that human beings have thought about before. We are in uncharted terrain here. And I think that's really true, and I think that's what made my interest in this book really take off, is we can do this. And whether we will or not, whether it's wise or not, whether we're going to end up reducing the risk or increasing the risk of climate change is still certainly an open question. But it brings up so many interesting questions that as an environmental journalist you don't get to deal with very often, especially in a fresh way. Moral questions about who has the right to do this, engineering questions about how we would do this, ethical questions about, should we do this, fairness issues, justice issues, all kinds of really interesting questions that no one had thought about. And so for me as a journalist, that was just like a big, lemon meringue pie sitting there. And I really loved it. But the second thing that really turned me in this story was, okay, so I started, after meeting Lowell, I thought, are all these people half crazy like Lowell? Are these guys are all nutty? And if Lowell was the archetype, then I would have to say yes. But then I went to see another guy named David Keith, and this is a picture of David that I took, actually. He and I went to the Arctic last year and did a trip, a cross-country ski trip across the Arctic, and this is a picture of him. And he's also a physicist, but of a very different sort. Grew up, his father was very involved in the whole understanding and banning of DDT as an environmentalist, and he is as diehard an environmentalist as anyone that I know, and loves the Arctic. He's Canadian, he's been to the Arctic many times, and he'd been thinking about geoengineering for about 20 years, about the engineering issues and moral issues and ethical issues. And I went to see him, and we talked about many of the things that I talked about with Lowell about how you would do this. But the thing that really turned my head and made me think differently about this was him saying this is a tool. And this, for example, he said, I care about the Arctic very much. And if you care about the Arctic, there's really no way to imagine saving that ecosystem other than geoengineering, other than using perhaps these reflective particles to cool things off. Because as we're going, the Arctic is basically a goner. The Arctic as we know it is a goner. And so the question is, should we do this? We certainly could do it. And it's impossible to imagine this as a conservation tool. It's possible to advocate this as a tool to reduce the risks and challenges of global warming. And so that really turned my head, because I began to think about all the prejudices and biases that go into this idea of our ideas about technology. And so David made me think entirely differently about that. David talked about other ways we would put sulfur particles up there instead of the garden hose that Lowell Wood loved, high altitude blimps floating around, dropping this stuff out of the sky. He also, this is a prototype, he was funded by a man I'm going to talk about in just a second named Bill Gates, who you may have heard of, to research and develop, and this is a artist's rendering of essentially a carbon-sucking machine, a machine that pulls CO2 out of the atmosphere. He's in fact, I think literally last week, a couple weeks ago, turning on the first prototype, not as large as this, of this machine. He has started up a venture capital money and money from Bill Gates to develop this, and is pretty much gung-ho. And there's a number of other scientists who are working on that also. So this is essentially what could be thought of as an iron lung for the planet, a way of pulling carbon and modulating the Earth's CO2 levels by building these machines, which are of course huge and expensive. But the final person who turned my head on this a little bit was Bill Gates. I went to see Bill because he funded David Keith and because he knows Lowell quite well, and he was part of the sort of early circle of people who were thinking about this. And Bill is very careful and thoughtful, but the thing that was most memorable to me about this is obviously Bill has done a lot of work in Africa and about trying to cure disease in Africa, solve environmental problems. And Bill is, of course, the consummate tool maker. And he said, what if manipulating the climate in this way? I mean, obviously, one of the things about climate change is that we know it's going to bring drought and change precipitation patterns. Africa, poor marginal cultures are most vulnerable, of course, to climate change and drought and things like that. And he said, what if we could develop a tool that could change those precipitation patterns, that could develop to change rainfall patterns, that by perhaps putting these cloud brightening machines off the coast of Africa, you could bring rainfall to the Sahel. I'm not saying Bill was saying, I'm not saying we could do this, but what if we could? There's a potential in this that this could happen. Do we, as the rich, wealthy West tool makers, have a moral obligation to pursue this if we can bring relief to these people, to these cultures, to these places? We've messed up the planet for them. We're the ones who've dumped all the CO2 up there. Do we have a moral responsibility to develop technology that might be able to help fix that in some ways? And obviously, Bill advocates cutting emissions first. He understands that this is a very high-risk idea. But that idea of this as a tool and if technology can go either way was very, very interesting to me, and Bill articulated that most clearly. So I'm going to wrap this up here and talk about where I came to, which was that this is a picture of course, development in the world, which is to suggest that we do a very bad job of developing the planet as it is. We've made a big mess of things. We're not very good at harmonizing our place as humans on the planet with what we call Mother Nature here. We are pretty much running ramshackle over the planet, building malls like this and things. And so if you imagine this extended into the atmosphere, that's a pretty nightmarish scenario. And there's no question that this is a very scary, scary Frankenplanet possibilities. There's notions of, one of the scary things about this is that individuals can do this. It's very cheap to do. Bill Gates would never, but he could. Or some other version of Bill Gates. For example, a lot of nuclear scientists and people who were involved in Cold War politics are very concerned about geoengineering because one nation can affect the entire planet. So it's the question of, as in in the Cold War, whose finger is on the trigger. Now here, whose finger is on the sulfate particle hose. And so there's obvious, I don't need to belabor the obvious scary scenarios about all this. But where I came out in thinking about this was partly inspired by seeing my daughter work in the garden and understanding that there's different ways of thinking about our relationship with nature and that it doesn't have to be about dominance and exploitation, that there's ways of working in harmony with nature, and that nature is not a thing out there that we exploit or not, but that we live with in more or less harmonious ways all the time. And in a certain way, I saw geoengineering as a kind of gardening the planet. In fact, I was skiing with David Keith one day. I was working on the book. It was a freezing day, and we were up at Banff skiing because he lives in Calgary. And we were talking about this, and he said, we were on the chairlift, and he said, it's about gardening the planet. Damn it, no one gets that. And by that he means this idea of working with nature, not about building a sort of some kind of solar shield that that is impervious to anything that we don't want to come at us, or that gives us absolute control. But maybe we can use some of these tools to nudge things one way or another, like to use cloud brightening machines to change precipitation patterns in Africa, something like that. And this idea of working in harmony that my daughter does in the garden was very sort of inspiring to me in thinking about this as a writer. And this is sort of where I ended up with the book. And my book is not an endorsement of this idea in any way, but the scariest thing to me is not crazy scientists and the hubris of the scientists, but apathy. And that's sort of where we are right now in thinking about this, is apathetic. We have done nothing about climate change. We've talked about it a lot. Certain people have talked about it, and we seem to be, in fact, in America, regressing. And in a certain way, I think this conversation about geoengineering, this active engagement with our climate, forces us to take a kind of responsibility. What kind of world do we want to live in? We're designing this world now, just like we're designing a house, we're designing a planet. And the sooner that we sort of acknowledge that, the better, and we can have that kind of conversation. And that's what I really hoped my book would do. And I thank the jury committee for helping me get this message out. Anyone have any questions? I guess we'll have questions for a few minutes here. Yeah.
Did you run across Freeman Dyson and some of his ideas?
I did. I talked to Freeman. Yes. Yes.
Is he in the crazy or semi-crazy?
Well, he's totally brilliant. Obviously, he's one of the great minds of our time. I would not put him in the crazy category at all. I would put him in the brilliant but unorthodox category, as many brilliant minds are. I mean, he had kind of wasn't terribly engaged in this idea. He thought about it some. He's interested, you may know, in other kinds of ideas like using genetic engineering to change the color of crop leaves. That's a possibility, right? By changing, if you could make, say, corn, instead of making it corn leaves and stalks, instead of being green, white. You had these huge areas of corn plant that you could change the reflectiveness of the albedo of the planet. Things like that he's interested in. And he's interested in this on the margins. He certainly likes, as he expressed to me, he thinks that this idea, he's not afraid of this idea. But he's not, unlike Lowell and some other physicists who came out of the Cold War, he's not been actively engaged in this discussion as much.
Just curious, when you talk about sulfur, why the words acid rain don't follow right away.
Yeah, a lot of people ask that, and people ask about particle pollution too, in the sense of, as we know, particle pollution from coal plants and things causes all kinds of health effects, asthma and all kinds of things. The simple explanation is that the amount that would be required to do this is so tiny that it would be practically imperceptible in the big picture. And also this, unlike the acid rain and the sulfate particles that are put into the atmosphere by coal plants, those are put into the lower atmosphere in the area sort of where we breathe. This would be high up in the stratosphere, 70,000 feet or so. They would gradually rain out, but very, very gradually. And even the biggest opponents of this idea acknowledge that acid rain and public health issues are not really the problem. And not public health issues in the sense of direct inhalation of these particles, because the amount of stuff that's out there raining down on us right now is so huge. This is a tiny, tiny change in that, really. What do the opponents say? Oh, how much time do we have? They say a lot of things. I mean, on the biggest level, they say, you know, we don't understand this system at all. Once we start mucking with it, it's going to, you know, we won't even know what we're doing. I mean, we'll start manipulating it in one way, and it's very hard to detect the actual effect this is having, and so the sort of cause-effect relationship is going to be very difficult to determine. That we will potentially knock our climate system is already, of course, being knocked out of whack by the greenhouse gases that we dump into it every year. But we'll further magnify that by messing with it in ways that we don't really understand. There's questions of war, of using this, you know, as a tool of war, of one nation deciding to do this. If, you know, and I'm not going to pick on anybody, but let's just say China had a major famine and drought, and, you know, in China they have a huge fleet of, and by the way, if you read my book, I'm a big fan of what's happening in China. So this is not a China bashing moment at all, but they have a huge fleet of rockets and airplanes for cloud seeding that they use all the time, and cloud seeding essentially doesn't work. I mean, some marginal, but they do it. They spend millions of dollars and have lots of airplanes, and they do it because politically it looks great. Right? The farmers are out in the field, you know, the crops aren't growing, there's no rain, here comes the jets, you know. Politically, this is a good thing. They're doing something to help, even if it doesn't really work. And sometimes if coincidentally it does rain, all the party guys in that town are back in for a long time. So it could be politically a dangerous tool, because you could see how if, like, China had a major famine, or India, or Texas for that matter, people there could decide to do this, you know, just to say, we're going to try to bring rainfall here by putting sulfur in the atmosphere, and you can't stop me. There's also the issues of, one of the biggest issues is that we'll be seen as a quick fix, that, you know, whatever inertia there is, which of course in the US is not very much about cutting emissions, will be derailed by this fantasy that we can solve it all by spraying some dust up into the stratosphere. And that is a very dangerous idea also, but, you know, I frankly don't see a whole lot of inertia happening anyway, so there's not much to derail. And I don't think that they're mutually exclusive. It's one or the other.
I feel better about this idea if I could think of one geoengineering project that actually worked. I mean, the ones we know about, the diversion of the Aral Sea, you know, the channeling of the Aswan Dam, the channeling of the Mississippi, they've all had disastrous unintended consequences. So have any of the advocates come up with something that has been done in the past that's actually not had these unintended consequences and worked out the way it was expected?
Well, these, you know, large earth-moving projects, you know, I mean, I write about this a lot in my book. I mean, the idea of using nuclear weapons to dig harbors in Alaska and things like that. I mean, history is full of bad engineering projects. But of course, there's also good engineering projects. But I think the point with geoengineering and the people who think of, the scientists who advocate this just simply as something that we should explore, no one basically advocates that we should be doing this yet, but we should be thinking about this, that it should be part of the toolbox. I think the idea is you start small with small experiments, and you do it with experiments that are reversible. So you try putting a little sulfur particles into the stratosphere, perhaps, in a certain area. You study it, you see what the effects are. They rain out within a year, they're gone. You see if it works. If you see if there's any kind of detectable changes, and then same thing with the idea of cloud brightening. You brighten a few clouds, you see what happens, they go away. And then you learn from that, and with an intelligent kind of step process like that, you don't end up with, you know, physicists trying to dig harbors in Alaska with nuclear bombs.
Can you tell us a little bit about the politics?
Sorry,
over here.
Oh, sorry.
Over here. For example, John Holdren, who is the White House science advisor, seemed to be very open to geoengineering until he opened his mouth to us, to AP, about it, and then it was smacked down there. What do you see as the politics inside the United States about even talking about it? There's an odd little left-right thing, because you have people, you know, groups like the Competitive Enterprise Institute, which is a far-right group that is very big on this. How would you map out the politics of geoengineering in the U.S.?
Well, that's very tricky, and that's a great question. I think that it's, given how little we've done on cutting emissions, on doing any, I mean, our president won't even talk about climate change. He won't even say the words, right? He'll talk about clean energy, but he won't even talk. So we don't even have a dialogue about climate change, so much less any real dialogue about what to do about it. So I think that within the current political debate in the US, it's, kind of suicidal for any progressive-minded politician to talk about this because, you're skipping over what we should be doing, which is the hard thing that takes political leadership, which is to say, okay, we need to put a price on carbon and we need to deal with this problem the sane way, which is to cut emissions. And instead, you're going to tell me we're going to solve this by by funding NASA to put particles in the stratosphere. I mean, that would politically, it's a dangerous, dangerous place, and I don't think anyone's going to go there. However, I do think it could change if we get into some kind of climate emergency kind of thing. I mean, I think that the real political complexity happens when, we've had this year of extreme weather, and how quickly this is going to change, whether this will escalate, all that. I think the real danger comes when we have climate scientists hauled up into Congress and saying, what can you do about this? We've got big problems with the weather, with the climate, we've got huge droughts, we've got wildfires, what can you do? And in that context, you could imagine someone saying, well, one of the things that we could do quickly, and it isn't very expensive, is we can put some of these particles up there. And I think we should, NASA doesn't have much to do now anyway, let's fund them and see if we try some of this. And of course, the dangerous thing that David Keith talked about is everybody who's thinking about this now is really ethical. I mean, not everyone, but in general, it's a very ethical community. They're very aware of the Cold War past of this, of the possibility of militarization, of once it gets out of the sort of thoughtful hands. And that's what is scary about the development of this, is that you can see that people would be very careful about it now. Science projects would be carefully planned, be reversible and all of that. But once it gets sort of taken out and used for political purposes in an emergency or something, who knows? It's just like the guys who worked on the nuclear bomb were, of course, thoughtful and had lots of moral and ethical issues and reservations about, well, to some degree, some more than others. But nevertheless, that was part of the context. And then, of course, it gets developed and it gets used for other purposes. And that's the scary thing here. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I'm Suzanne Reber. I'm with National Public Radio, and I lead the investigative team. So it gives me a lot of pleasure, actually, to switch gears a little bit from a grand idea and a lot of research over a number of years to switch to a newsroom environment where things are happening very quickly. And what we're going to talk about today is actually the spring of 2010. So the last spring, 2011, was a lot of political upheaval all over the world. And the spring before that, I call it kind of the spring of disasters. I mean, I don't know if you remember, we had an explosion at Massey Energy, a massive mine explosion, killed a lot of people. And then we had the Deepwater Horizon explosion. And I think the whole world was captivated with those images. So I want to take you back right there. Any newsroom is reliant on Associated Press to tell us what's happening right now. Tell me the next story, the next story. The wires come across every second if you have it up on your screen. I actually turn it off because it's very distracting. So here you have an Associated Press that we all rely on to tell us what is the latest story, what's happening in Libya, what's happening in Yemen. But that spring, something else happened. There was the horizon, there were those images of the explosion, that incredible image, and a lot of these images came to us from AP, and that's what we rely on them for. But something else happened in the newsroom, apart from the, what happened, who did it affect, the terrible loss at sea of those folks who died in that explosion. But the team that we're honoring today asked some other questions as well, and I think that's it gives me a lot of pleasure to actually be here today celebrating the other questions they asked. How did it happen? How did it come to be? Who's responsible? Now, I think it was about 10 days ago, the report came out, sort of the official report on what happened and what caused the blowout preventer not to work, and what about the cement plugs, and why didn't they work? But the team at Associated Press asked those questions, in 2010, and in fact found out a lot of the answers for us. And while a lot of the reporters in the Associated Press were feeding that daily beast that we are all a part of, there was another team, and it was dozens of reporters all working together. And trust me, I'm a team leader. I know what it means to herd cats and get everybody working together on one big story. And that is exactly what they did. And they asked those questions and got a lot of those answers very early on, from the environmental damage, what was going on in the ocean. What about the blowout preventer? What about the companies that were duking it out and cutting corners over the systems that were supposed to protect that rig and the people that work there? So today, it's a team that we're honoring, and a very different kind of set of research, talking to people in an environment where companies were, there was tons of spin. BP was out there telling us they were doing everything they could. Various news organizations are tracking the story. But the Associated Press banded together and actually explored all of these elements. And what we felt as jurors, trying to avoid a Grantham Prize that was becoming a book prize, and we talked a lot about that. The research that goes into a book is considerable. But working on original journalism, investigative journalism, in an environment like a news agency, that's a special thing. And we felt that the entry deserved the merit for the breadth of all the stories they tackled and the numbers of people that all relied on each other to report that out. So as an investigative reporter myself, it gives me a lot of pleasure to welcome Jeff Dunn to the stage. And he's going to talk to you more about the coverage and the team that put it together. So I'd like to congratulate you and the team on the Special Award of Merit. Congratulations.
So let me start by saying something I've wanted to say my whole career at the AP. I wanted to say anything on behalf of the Associated Press. And on behalf of the Associated Press, I thank the Grantham organization. We're really honored, and we really, really appreciate the award. We're thrilled. So once upon a time, not so long ago, most of us in this room probably thought that a blowout was what happened when a truck had a problem on the highway and it threw those chunks of rubber all over the highway. And when the BP well blew out, we all had to learn a new vocabulary, and we learned about blowouts, and we learned there were blowout preventers. Who knew that there were blowout preventers? These gigantic sets of valves. We learned that mud was not just what you tracked in to the kitchen and what your spouse yelled at you for, but that it also acted as a lubricant and it helped prevent blowouts. So all these technical aspects of this complicated story were part of the challenge. But for us at the AP, I think the story was even a bigger test of some new elements of our operation. We had reorganized in the last few years our command structure, in effect, to decentralize it. And we have now these 4 regional hubs that oversee big stories. We had put a greater emphasis on our investigative work, I think partly to fill a vacuum with our members having more trouble doing that kind of work in recent years. And the BP spill provided a test of some of those new elements. It also obviously challenged all our old institutional habits, and we used all those historical skills as well. And one example is this photograph that's become, I think, sort of an iconic photograph of the spill that Gerald Herbert in our New Orleans bureau took. Typical to someone with an AP instinct, he chartered the helicopter without permission to charter the helicopter. And luckily for Gerald, the permission came before the helicopter landed. I mean, we started in 1846 with the Pony Express, but Gerald just jumped on a helicopter. And they're pretty expensive to run. So we put together these two sets of skills, these new ways of doing things, and sort of our institutional capabilities to cover big breaking stories that we've done pretty well for decades. And I think my marker that it worked pretty well in the end was all these firsts. I was a slow runner as a kid, and to be associated with a whole bunch of firsts is a new experience for me. But we were the first to report the blowout itself. 2 days later, we were the first in reporting that the Transocean rig had gone under. We were the first in reporting that the spill was much larger than BP was reporting. And my colleague Seth Borenstein, a science writer at the AP, who's sitting over there. Do you mind just standing up for a second and waving to the nice folks, Seth? He was very involved in that all along. Weeks later, we were still trying to be first. And we were the first to report that there were about 28,000, 27,000 other wells in the Gulf of Mexico that had either been temporarily abandoned, temporarily as a term of art. Some of these temporarily abandoned wells were temporarily abandoned for decades, it turned out. But there were all these wells that also had been abandoned, like they were temporarily abandoning the Macondo well, and that there was no program to monitor them for leaks. And we finally, we nearly had to choke them, but we finally got the federal government to acknowledge that some had leaked in the past, yes. So this all started April 20th, 2010. Big breaking news story. Our managing editor, that's Mike Oreskes, organized a coverage plan, and there were some interesting aspects. We had this new deregionalized command structure. Our south region was run out of Atlanta, and you know, it used to be at the AP that there was an editor in New York who was looking over your shoulder and giving you guidance. Guidance for me is a euphemism. We actually ran that story out of Atlanta. It was a new thing for the AP test. The South Regional editor, Brian Caravillano, was assigned to oversee the story. His deputy editor at the time, Lisa Payne, was charged with the day-to-day spot story. Lisa, do you mind standing up for just a second and also waving at the nice folks? Thanks. Note how this is sort of broken down into manageable slices. The West Regional editor, a deputy editor, Josh Hoffner, was charged with covering the wellhead and efforts to stop the leak. So our managers quickly saw that it was going to be very complicated and you needed to break it down more than the usual bear. Our national investigative editor was in right at the beginning, Rick Penchak. Do you mind standing up for a second, Rick, and waving? Rick Penchak, and he was in charge, he was assigned to oversee the investigative efforts that began right away, and of course, the center of activity was in our New Orleans bureau. Brian Schwanner was the center of that activity. And Suzanne's wonderful introduction, she mentioned all the people involved, and I was just one of the investigative writers. I feel kind of guilty about being up here. But we had couple dozen people working on the story out of the New Orleans Bureau. We had about 45, 50 people who ended up flying down into that area for the story. We had 200, 250 people at the AP working on the story. We had all format planning meetings, digital format, text, audio, graphics, so on and so on and so on. Those meetings were conducted up to twice a day. So it was a very complex undertaking, and it was very, from where I sat, remarkable how well we got people to play nice. And in a moment, I think I'll mention one or two other aspects that I think helped us get people to play so nicely. The thing I was most heavily involved in was that early investigative thrust. We formed this ad hoc investigative team. I say ad hoc because there were people who were formally designated as national investigative writers like me. There were other people who came from our regional investigative teams. There were a few others as well, and about 15 people, I think, in all. And we formed a group that worked apart from the daily breaking coverage. And the AP has really been so successful in so many ways in covering breaking stories that I think over the years, I've been with the AP for 25 years, it's sometimes had trouble focusing as much as it meant to on the investigative side of things, but it got this right, and it's begun to get this right, and it really protected these people from the daily crush of news. Had them work separately. It broke out of the normal chain of command. I work for Rick, who just stood up a moment ago, but other people that I worked on a story with Seth, who just stood up. I worked on a story with Mitch, a number of stories with Mitch Weiss, who worked for other people, but took their marching orders temporarily from Rick. That really is something at the AP, because historically we were sort of broken down into these fiefdoms of local bureaus. So we're discovering new ways of working as teams, I think. We had in our investigative group frequent phone calls for brainstorming and assigning people into smaller story teams, and those meetings were run by Brian Caravillano and Rick Penchek. And if they told you to do something, you might work for somebody in North Carolina, but you did it. And you did it happily. Science team and specialty writers became engaged. The business staff, the environmental beat staff, they rotated people in. The News Research Center put out a bunch of wikis to keep track of the facts and try to make sure that we were all on the same page with this stuff. A little bit about what we came up with. There was a focus on the wellhead. We found that blowout preventers were known to fail in the past. I guess I should say we started by loading scores of documents, accident reports, investigation reports into a web app called Document Cloud. It lets you search, makes everything accessible. You can do some fancy things, make up timelines and annotate and do all kinds of stuff. I had to make sure everyone had access to the material. We found that there had been repeated breakdowns of the blowout preventers since regulators weakened testing requirements in the late 1990s. Dozens of failures in sealing wells with cement. The blowout preventers, by the way, were supposedly foolproof. Everyone in the industry virtually believed that they couldn't fail. All these abandoned wells that I spoke about earlier. We had a focus on the regulations. We found that BP was exempted from filing a plan for a major spill from an uncontrolled blowout. Regulators saw it as impractical. Federal inspections were fewer than the monthly standard on the rig, contradicting claims by regulators. we found this famous BP spill response plan. It's since become famous, and its glaring errors. You may remember the walruses and the seals that listed as living in the Gulf, and they actually don't, at least not for very long, if they are. BP promised it would marshal enough boats to keep oil from the shore. We all know now that that didn't happen. We had you can't see the video, that's okay, but part of our coverage was video, and Rich Matthews actually, who's a diver, dived into the Gulf and investigated there. I love his vocabulary. He dived amid these swirling spirals of oil that they call snot balls and globs of death. And he found that oil was blocking out a lot of light in some places. There were no fish where a diver expected near a rig, so that there were signs of impact. Graphics. We had this involved interactive with lots of modules, and it showed the efforts to control the spill and how that process unfolded. My favorite part was a tab on tracking the oil that's in the middle. It had week-to-week a regional map that showed how the oil sheen was extending. It looked like a weekly Rorschach test. It was really, really very interesting. And finally, we focused on the science and looked ahead. We surveyed scientists, about 75, about what they thought about prospects for the Gulf with the spill. They emphasized the resilience of the Gulf waters despite damage, but 6 months later, when we went back to them, they were more pessimistic about the future of the Gulf. So I think in the end, we had some impact. I would never claim that we were the only ones that created this impact, but I think we had some role in helping to nudge regulators and business to toward a different approach. And some of that is turned up with I think the overhaul of the Minerals Management Service to get the regulating side away from the side that oversaw the leases. We have new federal rules where rigs have to certify their blowout preventers and their standards for cementing. New federal rules that are meant to force more complete sealing of abandoned wells. BP has promised better testing of cement, stronger blowout preventers, and a better spill response plan. And the industry is also working on better blowout preventers, and I think that when such blowout preventers come online, it's going to be a long time before anyone claims that they're fail-safe and foolproof. Thanks, folks. Any questions that I can try to answer?
I forget when it was, but at some point, AP hired an oil spill editor, Steve Gutkin. I'm wondering if that proved fruitful in terms of this complex organizational process.
You're correct that we did, and I'm not sure what the answer to that question is, and I'll let any of my three colleagues who are closer to it, and I would be happy to handle it if I knew. I'm not really sure how to address that, but maybe one of my three colleagues is.
As you can imagine, it was a very time-consuming story with a lot of tentacles. And from personal experience, after a matter of several weeks of working 7-day weeks, 18, 16, 14-hour days, you really needed to have one person who could focus on this story. And he did that. He mastered that story. And he's now my deputy. So it proved fruitful for him as well, I think so.
And I think it's part of how we're breaking things into smaller pieces than we were before. And I think it just occurred to me now that that was part of the instinct that sent me to Tokyo earlier this year when they had the accident of the Japanese nuclear power plant because I'd worked on nuclear power, and they sent me not to write stories and not to supervise what people were doing on a daily basis, but just sort of to act as a technical resource for the Bureau. And it's something that 10 or 15 years ago, it just would not have happened. So I think that's all part of sort of this new way of breaking things down into smaller pieces and very complex stories. Yeah.
The president last June said that this was the worst environmental disaster in U.S. history. A couple months later, the senior environmental correspondent for the Times-Picayune told me he didn't see a disaster here. Which one is more right?
Yeah. I have to think, based on what our science people did, that maybe in the long run it won't be as serious as we feared. You know, I'm not sure that one's right and one's wrong, but I think that we were all somewhat surprised. I don't know. Yes, Seth is shaking his head yes, and heartened that, you know, even in the early days when people were sort of, there was a lot of fear and a lot of exaggeration about the impact before people knew that the scientists we talked to were generally, and Seth, correct me if this is not quite right, but generally optimistic about the ability of the Gulf to recover and about in the long term. And I think that was a real eye-opener for some of us, and it suggested that maybe the long-term effects weren't as significant as we feared. Thanks, folks.
Okay, it's my pleasure to tell you about this year's Grantham Prize winner. The great Anglo-American poet W.H. Auden, who, like our prize benefactor, was born in England and settled in the United States, wrote, "A culture is no better than its trees." Indeed, mankind has forever had this simultaneously dependent and destructive relationship with our forests. We rely on them not only for poetic inspiration, but for heat, for food, for medicine, for livelihoods, for flood and drought mitigation, and for continuation of more than half of the world's animal species. Notably, in the context of global warming and climate change, we rely on them to absorb absorb carbon and produce oxygen. But as James Astill documents in this remarkable, sweeping 8-part series published a year ago in The Economist, mankind has put all of this at great risk. This is particularly true in the tropics, which until the past century had been spared the destruction of forests that had been seen in the Americas and in Europe, or I'm sorry, North America and in Europe, but where in the past 6 decades the rainforest has been reduced by more than 60%. Mr. Astill, who is now the London-based energy and environment editor of The Economist, traveled thousands of miles to do his reporting to Brazil, Mexico, Indonesia, Uganda, to report firsthand on what The Economist called, quote, the world's lungs. His exquisitely crafted stories, which were illustrated with just stunning photography, I have to say, and really wonderfully explanatory graphics and maps, took readers where most of us will never go, introducing us to the indigenous communities who depend on forests, introducing us to scientists who study forests, helping us to understand the push and the tug between exploitation of our trees and preservation of them. He thrust the forest into the spotlight as an oft overlooked and misunderstood element of the international debate over climate change policy. And while he skillfully sounded the alarm about our forest, he makes clear that the situation is far from hopeless, and that the key really is that forests are undervalued even by those who rely on them, and that we really need a new paradigm to talk about the value of forests. Changing that will require both creative public policy and enormous political will. In that regard, and this is really perhaps the most profound part of the story, the Economist series appears to have already had great impact. It was published 2 months before the UN Climate Change Summit in Cancun. And we had included in the entry were several letters from participants in that summit. I'll quote from a couple of them here. The director of Norway's Climate and Forest Initiative, a gentleman named Hans Bratsker, said, quote, "The timing of the report made it exceedingly useful in informing key policy debates and contributing to the momentum that led to a long-awaited agreement on a mechanism to reduce deforestation in developing countries." A gentleman named Thomas Lovejoy of the Heinz Center for Science, Economics, and the Environment here in the United States called the report, quote, "remarkable," and said, "It is the single best overview of the plight and promise of the planet's forests. There's never been anything in journalism that approaches this work for substance and readability." We on the jury were similarly impressed with it, and we're delighted to recognize it with the 2011 Grantham Prize for Excellence in Reporting on the Environment. Please join me in congratulating James Astor.
Well, thank you, David, for those incredibly kind words. Thank you, Sunshine, and all those at the Metcalfe Institute who've brilliantly managed this award. And thank you, of course, to Mr. and Mrs. Grantham for your extraordinary generosity. And thank you all for being here. It's a tremendous privilege for me to be here, to see you, to have you listen to me. Thank you. I've been a journalist, tiny bit of background, for a decade or so, mostly with The Economist, mostly as a foreign correspondent, writing mostly about politics, a bit about business, and an awful lot about war, lamentably. This special report on the world's forests was much the biggest piece of work on an environmental topic that I've attempted. And though I am, as David said, now The Economist environment editor, I'm a very new and therefore rather ignorant one, having started the job only last month. I mention this partly in rather British fashion by way of apology. I'm sure I know an awful lot less about environmental topics than most people here, many people here certainly. But I mention it also because I think my experience in writing this report as a greenhorn writer on the environment with very few preconceptions about what that entailed may be instructive. So I suggested writing this report from my desk in Delhi, where I was charged mainly with writing about South Asia, and especially its politics, for two reasons. First, because I had since childhood a strong, simple love of trees, marvel at trees, and I'd also had a more recent interest in forest conservation, which I suppose I'd picked up, especially in the Congo Basin, early in my career, while looking for a lost gorilla subspecies. I think it never existed, actually, for genocidal Rwandan militiamen and otherwise messing about in woods. The second reason that I made this pitch to my bosses at The Economist was that I was aware of the huge prominence that forests and deforestation had assumed in the wider UN climate change discussion. And that topicality was presumably one reason why my boss was willing to okay this assignment. Having been commissioned, and this is the usual form for these special reports that The Economist produces, and we produce about 20 a year, recently including one or two you may be interested to know, you may already know, on environmental matters. Having been commissioned to write it, I was given a date to deliver my copy by, which was a few months down the road, and I would have, at some point in that time, 6 weeks to devote exclusively to the project, to researching and writing it, and the rest was up to me. This is a tremendous privilege in journalism, as many of you will know. It's quite unusual. In that allotted 6-week period, I could do more or less whatever I wanted to do. I could go more or less wherever I wanted to go, and I could spend any reasonable amount of money in so doing. And therein, I think, is another obvious lesson, though it's possibly not a very useful one. If you do want to write seriously about the world, it helps enormously to work for a profitable newspaper. And unfortunately, there aren't very many of those left. When it came to planning my report, I did just as I would for any topic, environmental or otherwise. I read up on the subject as widely as I could. I tried to find out who the most important experts were, including scientists and economists especially, and I tried to speak to as many of these people as possible. In the process of this, I was, of course, invited to ride quite a few hobby horses. The agroforesters could sound extremely obsessed. I think the agroforesters were especially obsessive, actually, about their métier, about agroforestry. The biologists sometimes couldn't see beyond biodiversity. But by and large, with my wishy-washy politics background, I was profoundly impressed by how clever, learned, and extraordinarily helpful these forest people were. I found them, and I'm not just saying this, I found them strikingly devoted to their subject, exceptionally keen to get wider attention to it, and thankfully tolerant of all my stupid questions, or possibly almost all of my stupid questions. And this was true in all the forest countries that I traveled to. As David mentioned, I went to quite a few. I was also just phenomenally impressed by what immediately I started hearing from these people. I naturally already knew that forests were tremendously important, that they were complicated. I knew something of their significance for carbon storage in hydrology, in safeguarding biodiversity, but I really had not known, had not imagined quite how absolutely, crucially, and almost miraculously important they are. Consider, if you will, the Amazon rainforest. It sequesters 1.3 gigatons of carbon a year, which is almost, and I haven't checked this, but I think it's right, almost half as much, Jeff probably knows, as the US power sector emits annually. It also plays a huge role in the regional water cycle, recycling water through evapotranspiration on winds blowing from the Atlantic coast right across the Andes. By one estimate, and I find this mind-boggling, between 1.25 of the water molecules that fall in the western Amazon have previously fallen on the rainforest. As for Amazonian biodiversity, it too is almost incredible. Even small gullies and runnels in the rainforest often have unique subspecies of monkeys, birds, all sorts of creatures. I found these truths absolutely mind-blowing, and I want to come across as a naive. I think it's important to, and that certainly was my position in doing this reporting. I found these things intensely dramatic, and I wondered, to my shame and embarrassment, why so many of them were new to me. I had, after all, been reading the world's best newspapers pretty assiduously for many years. So how was it that I knew so little about forest role, for example, in the carbon cycle? The answer was, of course, that I should have known much more than I did. There's an awful lot of excellent scientific and environmental reporting out there. Yet it is also true, I suppose, that not enough of it gets widely read. It may be too wonkish. It may be too forbiddingly academic. It may sometimes be just too boring to be digestible to the general reader. And this seemed to me to be a pretty obvious problem. And if environmental subjects are to grab more public attention, it should be addressed. Too little environmental or science journalism, I would suggest, expresses in a vivid, also serious way the wonder of the Earth's systems, the awe-inspiring power of nature. Too often, environmental and scientific dispatches on the wildest oceans and forests say almost nothing about what they look like, what they sound like. By way of contrast, you won't find many war reporters who get to the front line, manage to get themselves shot at, and then neglect to write about that. In British journalism, at least, most war reporters tend to write about almost nothing else. Reading the New York Times in bed last night, I came across a quote from Richard Dawkins, which helps to make this point beautifully, and more beautifully than I can. It goes, the feeling of awed wonder that science can give us is one of the highest experiences of which the human psyche is capable. It is a deeply aesthetic passion to rank with the finest that music and poetry can deliver. I say amen to that, even if Professor Dawkins might object to that word. So I understood from the start this to be part of the challenge of my assignment. It was to write about forests, about the wonder of them, the importance of them, and the perilous state that they're in a way that was both solidly scientific, but also evocative. And when it came to attempting that, it was hardly a challenge, it was a gift. To see dawn break over the rainforest as I did in Brazil and in Indonesia, to imagine the trees reinvigorated by photosynthesis was one of the most tremendous privileges of my career. With apologies to my former colleagues, the war reporters, it was incomparably more exciting than rumbling nervously through Fallujah in a Humvee. But however colourfully you do it, writing about forests and about other environmental subjects is clearly still quite a hard sell. If too much writing about the environment is dry science, that must be largely because editors too often consign it to their science sections, where dryness may be demanded. Throw out a huge question: why do we, in newspapers and otherwise, so undervalue the environment? I won't try to get stuck on a proper answer to that, but here's a simple one, offered by Tom Lovejoy, who was sitting here a little earlier, a wonderful biologist and a tremendous help to me in doing this research. He told me, we're social apes. We're so interested in picking fleas off each other that we ignore the world around us. I thought that was very good. I thought that was very well said, and I suppose it will also change. We'll have to raise our head from the fur and the fleas as the earth warms, as the political consequences of climate change, as business, hopefully business solutions to environmental problems become more ingenious, as the political consequences mount. As these things happen, as this pressure builds, environmental issues will inevitably gravitate to the news and business sections of our papers. At The Economist, I think if you compare our coverage now with a few years back, certainly a decade back, I think that migration has already substantially taken place. There's further to go. For my part, having no background, effectively no background in science reporting, it was very easy, it was obvious to see forests as only partially a science story. This was an economic story. It was about properly valuing natural capital. It is an intensely political story about conflict between local forest dwellers and their governments, about sparring between eco-concerned rich countries who've already chopped down their forests and poor ones who very naturally now want to chop down theirs. If you'll allow me, I'd just like to illustrate this, to just give you a taste of how gripping and how various I find this topic with a couple of small stories. One, I'm sure, is familiar to all of you, but let me rehearse it. Last year, Indonesia accepted an offer of $1 billion from Norway in exchange for a promise to greatly reduce its deforestation rate. What is being envisaged here is not obvious, as envisioned by the Norwegians at least. It's not just a giant conservation project. That money is not just, or perhaps at all, to create national parks or thousands of alternative livelihood projects. It is, the Norwegians hope, an effort to recast Indonesia's growth model. It's $1 billion of seed money to help them kickstart low-carbon, non-extractive, non-tree-cutting economic development. That is a phenomenally audacious project, which is exceptionally likely to fail, given how hard it will be for Indonesia to make this change, given how corrupt the country is and its forest sector in particular. But it is nonetheless, I think, a gripping political and economic story which demands our attention. Here's another one. Did you know that as an unexpected byproduct of the Mexican Revolution, 75% of Mexican forests are controlled not by the government as is the case in most forest countries, but by local communities. Is that not remarkable? Can you begin to imagine how exciting the World Bank Forestry Wonk team finds that? That's because many such experts consider community forest management, as this is known, to be an ideal form of forest stewardship, which makes Mexico, therefore, a utopian case study for many. I therefore went there to see how it worked, and sometimes it is clear this kind of resource management works extremely well. In one such relatively successful example, I visited a pine forest in the rolling green hills of Michoacan, where the local villagers spend their weekends hauling logs and planting trees. This meant they looked after the forest somewhat. It also gave them a useful income. And in a local population depleted by emigration to America, it also helped to bind their community together. And yet they complained that the local drug cartel, a quasi-religious cult called La Familia, had started illegally logging their trees, and the local police were too scared to intervene. This was an important forest story. It represented a style of management, of forest management, much talked about internationally. But it was also, at its core, an illustration of Mexico's crime wave, of its society. It was in these ways it's a brilliantly revealing political story. So far as I could, I tried to cram such things into my report: human stories, political, economic stories. My report had to be about far more than a grim environmental prognosis for the world's rainforests. And so, finally, if I may, a word on that grim prognosis, or at least on how I thought to write about it. The outlook for forests, especially these precious tropical ones, is very dark indeed. They're threatened above all by surging demand for land to grow food on. As you will all know, I'm sure, by 2050, global demand for food may double. That's the prediction. And most of that increased demand will be in developing countries where tropical forests are. They're also, as if that were not enough, gravely threatened by the fallout from climate change, to which, of course, deforestation makes a very large contribution. According to one recent study, a global temperature increase of 3.5 degrees, which is comfortably within, as Jeff said, very comfortably within the range of estimates for this century, will put paid to half the Amazon rainforest. If that were to happen, it would release up to 50 gigatons of carbon, which is the equivalent of 10 years of global emissions from burning fossil fuels. What could be a more terrifying scenario? Evidently, it's necessary to tell people about such prognoses again and again. But I think at the same time, we've also seen the limits of apocalyptic environmental journalism. The UN Climate Change Summit in Copenhagen in 2009 was a classic case. It was widely billed as the last effort to save the world. It failed, and the world's still turning, so what of that? That should sound flippant, it is. But it's a question that I think many of our readers would reasonably ask right now, especially when invited to read about the next last effort to save the world. The planet's environmental future may appear to be extremely grim. That is certainly what most climate scientists suggest. But it is still possible, amid this despond, to write about the future constructively. And if we're to get attention to that kind of writing, I think it's absolutely essential. Taking forests as an example, the latest solutions to deforestation as offered, including that Norwegian effort in Indonesia, look mostly extremely inadequate or far-fetched. And yet, for the first time ever, a lot of extremely serious, powerful, also wealthy people and organizations, including businesses and governments, rich governments, are grappling with this problem. So bleak as things may appear, as they do appear, that is new and tremendously positive. I'd like to thank you all for listening to me, and I'd just like to conclude with additional thanks to the jurors of the Grantham Prize for this wonderful recognition. It's a tremendous honor. I'm exceptionally humbled by it. And I'd like to thank the Granthams for the fantastic generosity that they've displayed in giving this wonderful prize. You must want your award to make a very big splash indeed among we impoverished journalists. Well, at The Economist, I think it's fair to say, it has made something of a splash. When I told one or two colleagues that I'd won this award, they were politely congratulatory, along the lines of, "Oh, yeah, well done." richly deserved. And then they find out how much cash came with this. 75 grand, are you joking? You mean there's money in this environmental nonsense? So that I hope is the response that you're looking for, and I wouldn't be surprised if there are perhaps a few entries from The Economist next year. Possibly from my colleague Matthew. Thank you all very much indeed. Sure. If anybody has any questions, I'd be delighted to try to answer them. Yes.
Yes, I just wanted to know what is the greatest threat to the forest? Is it local, the expansion of local agriculture, or is it timber purchases by countries like China?
It's certainly agriculture rather than forestry. That is clearing far more forest land. Actually, there is people in the world of these failing environmental causes often look for good news stories, as you know, but there is a modest good news story on forestry, and actually, notably in the case of China, it's China which buys a huge amount of tropical timber from Indonesia and the Congo Basin especially, is, because of its exports of goods to America, having to be a little bit more judicious in where it buys its wood. Certification schemes, such as they are, frail as they are, often rather weak as they are being adopted by the Chinese. Agriculture is a far, far bigger threat to all the world's tropical forests.
James, I have one question for you. One of the few positive developments at the otherwise disappointing conference in Copenhagen, we're now coming up soon on the second anniversary, I believe, was a series of pledges by some of the industrialized countries, including this one and Great Britain and Norway, as I recall, to do something concrete about deforestation. And that seemed like something that was eminently doable because it did not involve mandatory carbon limits and inspections and so on. What's become of all of that? Have you kept track?
Yeah, I have. Some things come of it. The Norwegian offer, after Copenhagen, there was a certain amount of momentum for 2-3 months. There was a new meeting on Rhode called the Rhode Plus Partnership. I'm sure you're familiar with Rhode. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the Rhode, this extraordinarily ambitious scheme or dream or somewhat institutional design whereby rich countries, possibly through carbon markets, would pay poor ones to keep their trees standing. Well, that gathered some momentum after Copenhagen. Additional pledges of money were made, but things have slowed down enormously since then on both sides of the line, from the developed countries, also from the tropical forest countries. What happens in Indonesia and what's happening in Brazil are tremendously important as test cases for building confidence in these things. These are two countries most important for their tropical forests and the rate in which they're disappearing, which do have some capacity to get such a scheme working, and they have some political will to attempt this, especially in Brazil. The last 12 months has been a lot of political pushback in those countries, and that's one reason why the scheme has slowed down enormously. The Brazilians, I think, are most depressing because expectations for them was so high. There's a strong political lobby to change the laws of forest management in the Amazon region. If a bill that's sitting in the Senate right now, it's already passed the lower house, gets through, then landowners, almost all of whom are sitting on illegal parcels of land, will be able to chop down legally huge amounts of forest. Most of them already have chopped down that forest, so it's an amnesty, which will, of course, encourage more land grabbing. So that battle is being fought, and it's absolutely critical. And if anybody's interested in this issue, they should follow it and take a signal from it. But from the rich country side, the benefactors side, progress has also been rather disappointing, because of discouraging signals from those countries, but also because, for very obvious reasons, a lot of the money that was promised simply hasn't been delivered on. The Norwegians are out on their own, and indeed it's becoming increasingly clear that a lot of the other money that was promised was not new money at all. It was sitting in some ODA budget, unspent or already spent or already committed. So the thing's a bit of a mess. I think, as I said, I don't think we should damn it. This unlikely, messy, thoroughly disappointing, in many ways incredible effort to make a radical difference to the rate of tropical deforestation that's going on and we can expect is nonetheless by far the best news in forests since ever. It is a remarkable endeavor. So we need to be realistic about it. We need to applaud the ideas of it, because if this doesn't work, it will establish some principles that I think will remain very key. It's already established the possibility of using forests as a major offset. It's already established serious political interest in this issue in all of the rich countries of the world, and it has given countries like Indonesia and Brazil at least a certain amount of pause to consider the possibility. They're waiting for more money to come, they're waiting to see if they can swing this thing politically in their own countries, but it's given them pause to consider this alternative mode of economic development whereby they get benefit from their natural capital, they leave their trees standing, and this is an opportunity for them, not an opportunity lost to grow their economies. Yeah.
You spoke earlier about your, quote, shame and embarrassment at not reading about these issues more. And I'm just curious if you had an opportunity to suggest 2 or 3 things that could happen other than great prizes like the Grantham Prize. How can that be changed? We do read more, but there's still so much we don't read. And my own sense is that talk shows is an incredible lack of information coming across, that millions of people are missing an opportunity to learn something. And I'm just curious, from someone in your position, what 1 or 2, 3 things would you like to see happen that could change that?
Well, 2 things. I think if there was prescription, what I was saying, it was directed at newspapers and journalists. I think these are fabulous stories, and I think they're very dramatic stories. I think they are dramatic stories, these environmental stories, and I don't think that comes across especially often in the reportage, perhaps because of their place in the editorial system, perhaps because they're too often consigned to science sections when they are bigger, pressing current affairs stories, political stories. I think there is a great opportunity for journalists to be writerly about the environment. That's certainly what I tried to do. And I think that despite diminished newspaper budgets, especially for foreign travel, foreign reporting, despite all of this dollar in the newspaper industry, there is no doubt that these issues will become more current, will start to dominate news agendas, and I think journalists should embrace that opportunity. But from the other side, and this is just a sort of passing thought, if you're interested to read more and you're frustrated that you don't easily find interesting information on forests, just for example, but the environment generally in your newspapers, in all seriousness, I would urge you to get onto the internet and look at the academic press on this stuff. It's incredibly good. I'd hardly read a science paper before I embarked on this report, and I was amazed at how brilliantly many of them are written and how crisply and clearly. It made me wonder what skill at all journalists might have, because, and especially, no tittering please, especially having a background mostly in politics, where any analysis thrown out by some think tank, or rather must go on for 50, 100, hundreds of pages. It was amazing to read something which was about an idea crisply expressed in 2 or 3 pages. That's the academic science press. Go to it. It's really, really rewarding.
So you mentioned that you had several weeks of leave to pursue this, and Mr. Dunn mentioned.
I'm not sure leave is quite the word.
At liberty for investigation, and you mentioned the AP regrouped and deployed a small army. Is that magnitude of effort necessary for good environmental reporting, or do you see opportunities for individual reporters?
These are you can't compare. You have to compare like with like. I was doing a very broad but single feature article in a sense, divided into different parts. And moreover, 6 weeks was the limit. I had to do what I could in 6 weeks. That's just the way we work. The AP was on a completely different mission.
Can I just clarify? I didn't mean to compare the two. I meant to point out that both seem to be larger efforts than a couple days, a reporter calling a couple people and writing a story and publishing it. Do you think that magnitude of effort is necessary?
I don't think you could write Economist-style special report in much less than 6 weeks. So if you want to produce such a piece of work, you need to spend 6 weeks on it. I think we're fortunate that we can do that. It's not a great deal of time for quite a big piece of work, but it is striking that not all that many of our colleagues on other papers have even that opportunity to spend time on a topic.
I think part of what occurs to me about this is that I think some editors sort of pigeonhole environmental writing into a special thing that's got to be explanatory, and don't look at it simply as they look at a lot of other things as a potential for a great story. Is it environmental? Yes, but it just happens to be environmental. We did a project a few years back at the AP on pharmaceutical traces in the water. We found that there were traces of pharmaceuticals, largely from human excretion, but also from release by factories. Traces of pharmaceuticals in the water we documented about 55 million Americans. And when that story came out, that dominated newsplay. Was it an environmental story? I guess it was. But it just totally dominated newsplay, and we, you had all the requisite hearings, but to this day there are states that are considering there were laws passed, states considering additional laws to restrict pharmaceuticals in the water. It really, really had a discernible impact, and my point here is that it wasn't pigeonholed as an environmental story in our minds. To this day, I don't think of it as an environmental story. I just think of it as a great story. So I just think we need to stop thinking about these stories as necessarily explanatory. There are great explanatory stories, but there are just great stories that happen to be environmental. That's my gut reaction.
Question for all three of our winners. It's an American question, but I think you'll find it interesting to contemplate a little bit. We're in an environment right now in the conversation about these subjects in which there is certain kinds of politically dogmatic viewpoints. There's probably a substantial percentage of Americans who would say at this point that climate change science is a myth. We had a debate of one of the major parties where I think virtually everybody on the stage agreed that it was made up. So that is a wing of the American population that has a viewpoint. And, there is a wing of American politics that says the best solution to our problems is to substantially restrict the environmental protection agencies. That is the answer. So as environmental reporters, people, how do you then write about, think about, present material when you know that a percentage of your audience takes an almost religious viewpoint, a dogmatic viewpoint? If I hear these words, climate change, I know it's wrong, I know it's made up.
I mean, I don't write for any particular party or any political group. I'm just trying to work out what realities are and write about them. And of course, there tends to be a very polarized response to any writing, any journalism, somewhat about climate change. I know that the Granthams and the Metcalfe Institute are very interested in the response that our work gets, and so was I. In the case of this report, it came really in two streams. There were an awful lot of letters, emails written to me about the report, and they were mostly from academics or politicians or movers and shakers. Mostly, I suppose, sympathetic, thinking that this was an important topic and saluting the report. A few of them, including a few Republican congressmen, just being derisive and deriding the report and rehearsing their views about climate change, their skepticism. But possibly more interesting, gratifying as it is to be congratulated by important people, but perhaps more interesting was what was written in the comments section, the comments online, where unfortunately I think most of the kind of the old tradition of writing a letter to the editor seems to have migrated there, and mostly pretty disappointingly. But there also the views were very polarized. There were an awful lot of extremely skeptical people just sort of saying this is nonsense, because climate change is nonsense as described. But there were quite a lot of people, and this is what I found most satisfying, who said, I'm prepared to be open-minded about this because it's interesting, because I found it a good read, because I thought it was interesting to read about Brazil, and I'm prepared to kind of suspend my disbelief willingly on the topic of climate change and be drawn into what you're saying, because there's more to it than just carbon. And I thought that was kind of good, that I'd got some people who were basically closed-minded towards these topics to read about it.
And I think part of the answer too is in the sourcing, that you choose the kind of sourcing. You try to make sure that you're not relying on sources that have that kind of political connotation, that are directly involved in that in the political debate and the arguing. And for the BP oil spill, I did a lot of work on problems with wells, technical problems, and the majority of my sources were petroleum engineers who believed in what was happening in the Gulf, and so were extremely credible when they say it's not safe enough, and here's why it's not safe enough. So I think some of the answer is to try to rely on sources that are particularly credible.
The only thing I would add to that is I think it's also changed the way certainly I and the editors that I work with think about our beat. Because I think now part of the story, certainly for me and for my editors, is starting to try to write about why this, we've taken several steps backwards in our understanding about climate science especially, and looking at the disinformation campaigns, the people that are funding it, how this is working, the sort of political mechanism behind this whole apparatus that is quite apparent and clear. And I think that certainly a lot of journalists that I know are trying to cover that more and unearth that, and that becomes a big part of the story also.
We're all going to head up to the 4th floor, which is the skyline level, for a reception to honor the winners. Before we do so, I would like to offer final congratulations to James Astle and Jeff Goodell and the entire team at the AP, but especially Jeff Don for representing them on behalf of Metcalf Institute and the Grantham Prize and the Grantham Foundation. And I finally would just like to say one last quick thank you to Columbia University, Climate Week, New York City, the Metcalf Institute staff for always making our events so nice, and the jurors for the Grantham Prize, and finally the Grantham Foundation and the Grantham family themselves for supporting this really phenomenal prize and inspiring the sorts of conversations that we were having here and which I hope to continue upstairs. Thank you all very much.